Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm your host, Matt Bennett. Each episode we talk about the research and practical aspects of the trauma informed movement. This podcast is not designed to replace mental health services. If you feel uncomfortable or triggered by our discussion, please consider seeking your own trauma treatment. In no way is seeking treatment an admission of weakness. It is a chance to build resiliency and experience post-traumatic growth. You can find show notes, resources, and more at traumainformedlens.org. Welcome, friends, to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm very excited to have our conversation today with Kat Houghton. So, Kat and I have talked a little bit and realized that we share a passion for using biometrics. So if you know my work lately, just published my book on heart rate variability. You can download a free copy at optimalhrv.com. So just want to throw that out there because I think we'll get into a little bit of that discussion and kind of our shared passion of how to really look at behavioral health, mental health, and how our technological advancements allow us to do that in new and exciting ways. So, Kat, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I'm excited to have you on the podcast and introduce a little bit about yourself and your work for our listeners.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I appreciate your invitation to speak with you today. So I'm a psychologist by background. I spent 15 years working with kids with autism and their parents, and got my PhD developing parent training programs for underserved communities. And then made what seemed like this really weird, strange leap into software, and have for the last 11 years been running a software company. But it really, the leap was about wanting to be able to make interventions, behavioral change interventions, more accessible for people. And I kind of reached my limit clinically. There's only so many families you can see in a year, and realized that software would give me access, or give me just a much bigger scope, enable me to reach a lot more people. So our company, IllumaView, has been now running for 11 years, providing both web-based, wearable, and mobile data capture and intervention delivery systems, which are used for a wide range of different treatment studies and intervention studies, people with recovering from substance abuse disorder, people with suicide tendencies, people with trauma, PTSD, people wanting to learn mindfulness, reduce their anxiety, like across the range of sort of mental health. We've been supporting studies.
Awesome. And looking over your website, a very impressive stuff. I hope someday, as having a small startup myself, I can say, I've been doing this for a decade now. So hopefully I reach that point. So I'm blown away by the great work that you are doing. I also, interesting these connections, but also did a lot of work in the autistic realm, ran a special education school several years ago now. But I thought that was, really fascinating population to think about as far as, one of my questions that we had, because we worked with kids that often were too violent or dysregulated for the public school system. So we really got these great kids who nobody else kind of knew what to do with. And, I love that challenge. We had a great staff, and our job was to kind of figure out not how to get them to behave, but what they needed from us. Because, when we looked at it, they just didn't quite have the skills to do this. So I kind of wonder how taking in some ways, I still see autism as a little bit of a mystery. You listen to people who are world-class experts in this, and they come at this autism from so many different ways. And I haven't heard one to say, okay, now I get it. It seems like if you have an area of specialties, that's kind of how you look at autism. So I just kind of wondered, coming out of that work and starting to measure kind of what's going on inside or underneath the skin with folks, what sort of insights have biometrics given you into the world of autism, but also just kind of expand that into mental health as well?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so when I was working with kids with autism, I wasn't really aware of biometrics. This was like 20 years ago. That wasn't in my consciousness. But what I was aware of was being able to sense when a child was ready for interaction, when they were open for engagement, and when they were not. And it was just going to be like a bad time to try and introduce something.
Yeah.
And I could basically, I learned to sense that in my body. So I use my body as a tool for knowing, are they with me? Are they available right now? Which was hugely helpful, because as you know, if you try and go in with some kind of learning opportunity, however fun it is, if they're not available, they're not regulated in that moment, it's not going to
Not
end
ready.
well.
Yep.
So that was my first sort of understanding of that, of our physiology and the way it impacts our availability for relationship, our availability for learning, for productivity, whatever it is, and realized that my body was an instrument in sensing that for myself. And I got a whole load of more self-awareness through working with these kids, but I could also sense that in others. So when we did move into software, and this was 2009 when I started to move into software and started looking at wearables that were out there, was coming from that perspective of like, how can we, so especially for kids or people that don't have the ability to verbally communicate, or maybe don't have the awareness, the self-awareness, haven't developed that yet to be able to fully communicate what kind of emotional state they're in. I could really see the benefit of wearables that are feeding that back either to the user or to the user's caregiver, which most likely would be the case in someone that's not verbal. So we started to work. We worked with a center up in upstate New York, who worked with sounded like similar children that you were working with, Matt, that wanted to be able to give their staff a warning of any upcoming aggressive or challenging behaviors coming from the kids, because it was a big, they were working with, kids 15, 16-year-old. They were, they're big kids. So we worked with them with, actually, at that point was a sensor that wasn't even on the market. It had come right out of the Media Lab at MIT, and was monitoring electrodermal activity, EDA, which is the same stuff in a lie detector test. It's basically how much sweat is coming out of your pores, essentially, which turns out to be a pretty amazing, it's measuring arousal. So we could start to see when arousal levels were going up in these kids. And we pair that with video. And it was really fascinating because you could see on the biometrics, you could start to see arousal levels rising. But on the video, it's like, you can't see anything. Nothing's changing because there's often no affect. And then so suddenly what it looks like is there's this explosion from the child who's like suddenly launches themselves at somebody or has gotten really frustrated. And the staff didn't always see that coming, but we could see it coming from the wearables. So we developed a system that enabled that to be fed back to the staff. They had a tablet in the classroom where they could then monitor. They were working 5 or 6 kids at any one time. They could monitor that, and it would send them a little alert if one of the kids we started to see that pattern of arousal going up. So that's one example of how it has been used in that population.
Well, you made that the whole thing. One of the things that got me really passionate about heart rate variability was and I'm sure you've probably seen this study or something like it, is, and you really spoke to it, sort of that readiness for an intervention. When we started to say, I could see HRV and like physical health, and knowing a lot of elite athletes were using this device, like LeBron James, every bubble, whether it's the NFL, everybody's got their wearable device on at this point. The thing that got me like really fascinated with this, was the how HRV measures social health. And, as you mentioned, as a therapist, whether I'm working with somebody who, might have a limited, a verbal ability, like with autism, but one of the things that, we know through trauma is really impacts the dorsal, or not dorsal, but the Broca's area, so that expressive area of the brain. So a lot of times social cues, a lot like with autism, they might not express themselves in the same way. So that was a huge thing, for me to learn, was like, hey, actually, as a therapist, and my past work as well, to know this person's ready for, in the trauma world, a very intense intervention. Trauma treatment is not always a pleasant, easy thing to go through psychologically, and to like say, okay, now that we have a baseline on this person, they're ready for this today, or they might not be ready. And I love how you could track that, in the classroom in that kind of real-time way.
Yeah, so definitely readiness is like readiness in the moment is
Yeah.
huge, and also need in the moment, right? So that, I mean, there's two parts of that. It's like, yeah, is somebody ready for an intervention or ready to sit down and say, like, do a mindfulness meditation? So another study we're working with is at a University of Utah, and they're using stress, which is a combination of HRV and movement patterns
Hmm.
to determine at what point do they want to, they're working with people who are addicted to opioids.
Yeah.
So they're determining at what point do we want to deliver an alert to the phone that asks them, would you like to sit down and listen to a guided
Mhm.
meditation, essentially? And they can choose yes or no, and then they can choose which one they want to listen to. And then we monitor their physiology all the way through and ask them at the end how they're feeling. Um, but there's some nuances to that, right? So even if they, so just because we see that they're stressed doesn't mean that now is the time to sit down and do a meditation, right? There's a bunch of other factors that go into that, because they might be like in the middle of a business meeting and they're like, no, now's not the time. This is like healthy stress, or it's just not the time, right? So
Yeah.
there's other factors such as their location, for instance, or what they may have told us, or what we know about the patterns of their day. They just might not be available to do that
Yeah.
between 9 and 5. Um, so there's lots of other factors that go into. So yeah, physiologic. Just because someone's stressed doesn't mean they're ready to sit down and do some kind of meditation. Um,
Absolutely.
and those might be the moments where they need just a little reminder, being just like, hey, we're here, we see that your stress levels are rising, you got this, you're good,
Yeah.
check in when you have time, and we'll give you some meditations. Like, it might
Yeah.
be like a nuance in what you offer at that moment.
Right. And that's what another thing I think is so powerful. And I think your school example is where I really hope this sort of interventions like yours, are available in a kind of wide scale, is because I one of my the book before the heart rate variability book looked at trauma sensitive early education, and
Mm.
just young kids to say I'm angry, to say
Mm-hmm.
I'm feeling depressed today. I mean, they just haven't developed that area, especially with kids with trauma who are dysregulated and can, just don't have that ability to regulate themselves in a lot of ways. It's all of a sudden to gain some insight to say, hey, my heart rate variability is dropping, or I'm getting, my stress levels are rising.
Mm-hmm.
I need this now to interact this intervention. I just think that to give the user that insight of what's going on with them, just to put that label on it, I think opens up that ability for mindfulness, for being curious in a way that I think for some people has got to be life changing,
Mm-hmm.
when they just think something's messed up with them.
Right.
To say, no, this is your nervous system kind of acting up. And I wonder, and I was so fascinated to talk to you because of your experience in this, but just kind of, I would love to hear some of maybe your top few insights that have you've gained out of this, because yeah, I imagine your data is in many ways like mining gold a lot of times, and the questions you can kind of ask it. And so I just would love to spend some time. What are maybe your top 4 or 5 kind of epiphanies and insights that you've gathered through your decade plus working with biometrics at this point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think you just spoke to one of them, which is that the usefulness of biofeedback, like in bringing things into the consciousness, bringing our own
Yeah.
body's function into our consciousness. So as a psychologist, I'm very human-centered, right? It's
Yeah.
people that I'm interested in. So for a long time, I was sort of anti-technology. I was like, get away from that stuff, too much screen time, and it's not healthy. And
Yeah.
had lots of opinions about technology, which in many ways are valid, and I have really seen the benefits that can come from using technology in an intentional way,
Yeah.
and that's one of them is that biofeedback approach. That these kind of sensors, and they're commercially available, $100, it's nothing fancy, but they can tell us things about our body that for whatever reason we're not aware of in the moment. And so by having the phone or whether it's on the wearable screen, whatever it is, popping up and saying, "Hey, looks like you're feeling a bit more stressed right now. What's
Yeah.
going on?" It brings up a lot of what is subconscious processes up into the area of consciousness, so we can be aware of them. And that's only then, once they're in our consciousness, that we can start to shape them and work on them and be more intentional with them. So that's really been sort of a huge eye opener for me that, oh, it's not all bad, this technology stuff, right? There's ways that it can be used intentionally to really help people. So
Yeah.
that's certainly one of them, yeah.
And one of the other, like, what insights do you think? Because I know you use, at least from the website, one of the things I gleaned is your program is great for clinical studies as well, to give additional data for folks. And I just kind of wonder what, maybe from the provider perspective, the caregiver perspective, the educator perspective,
Mm.
how have you seen getting this level of data on students, clients, patients? How's that changed? You know, and I obviously feel free to go into different settings, but how's that changed how people deliver care and see
Mm.
their services?
Yeah, definitely. So there's so much data that we can collect that the human being is not necessarily aware of, right?
Yeah.
And that's one of the other advantages. So from a regular smartphone, you can collect that they have so many sensors in them that you wouldn't
Yeah.
believe. And we can collect all sorts of data. So I'm thinking of a migraine study that we did.
Mhm.
So they were looking at people with chronic migraines. Um, and the first phase of it before they went into intervention was really data collection, just trying to get a bigger picture of what was going on for people that reported like frequent and chronic migraines. So one thing is self-report. It's obviously ask them, when you tell us when you have a migraine and the severity and intensity and all that. But there was often things that were outside of the awareness of the patient, such as ambient light and ambient noise. Like what was the noisiness of the environment that they were in? How bright was the environment they in? What was the weather like? The barometric pressure, right? There's all these other factors that we just we don't compute really most of the time. But our phones are picking that up. And so
Yeah.
we fed that back to the researchers who started to see patterns. I mean, they had a suspicion that those things were playing a part, but they were able to use the data that came both from the passive sensors on the phone and from the self-report from the patients themselves to understand, okay, these things really are having an impact on the onset of migraines.
Fascinating. Yeah. And as somebody who struggles, mine are more episodic. And I've been like for 3 decades now trying to figure out what are my triggers, which,
Mm-hmm.
has never been consistent. Though you talk about barometric pressure, we were talking about before the show is that in Denver, Colorado, it was 100 degrees yesterday and it's snowing today. So like, I just got my fingers crossed that this doesn't explode at some point. I imagine we'll have a lot of people checking out early here just because of that pressure
Yeah.
change. But it's interesting, like, one of the things, and with autism, it was really a great teacher for me is, what in the environment triggers whatever it might be, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
suicidal thoughts, whether it's a behavioral issue, whether it's, a relapse, and sort of collecting that data, because a lot of times what we found, again, working with kids that, again, everybody else kind of like shrug their shoulders and say, this kid's too violent for us and we don't know really what to do. Sometimes it was just those, it's why I became a big fan of occupational therapy. It's like, hey, until we can figure out the sensory integration piece, my mental health background, I call myself an OT tech, because I needed to learn that world in order for my world to kind of be effective. And, in our classrooms, we took down stuff off the walls. You think about a
Mm-hmm.
classroom, you want it to be this vibrant, it's kind of an old school way to look at it if you talk to educators, but, bulletin boards and all kinds of colors. And we started like making it as bland as possible. And we could see those behaviors go down. Stop serving milk, which was a trigger for a lot of
Mm-hmm.
our patients as well. So yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that biometrics does is it allows us to collect that information to ask, a lot of different questions against, which I think is just so exciting for the folks in the mental health arena, where we have had trouble quantifying what we've done since, we started this science many hundred years ago.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's so the name of our company, Illumiview, is eliminating your view.
Yeah.
right? So to shining a light on that bigger picture of what's going on, that patient reporting, patient experience, I believe is really important.
Yeah.
And there's all this other information around that that the patient's just not aware of, like the
Yeah.
weather and the light and the sound and even the location, noticing patterns and what happens when they go to certain locations. And so it's really, yeah, using technology to it's almost like an extra senses, that we're broadening the senses so we can pick up on a lot more information and then start to query that data set and then
Yeah.
start to use machine learning and algorithms to create patterns, to notice patterns for individuals, so
Yeah.
that we're no longer operating at the group level, like everything gets reduced to the mean of the group. We can operate at the individual level.
Yeah.
So we can baseline that individual, know what kind of range they're typically operating in, whether it's EDA or HRV, that we're tracking both. And then so we can start to see automatically when they go outside of that range in either
Yeah.
direction. And that might then trigger an event on the phone or bring that to their awareness. And not imagining that every person is operating within the same range, because we all
Yeah.
have very different nervous systems, obviously, and those people with some kind of traumatic experience that are carrying that in their bodies are going to have a different, going to be different levels that they trigger than somebody who's not carrying that trauma. And so it's really important that we start personalizing our approach to each individual.
Absolutely. So I was dying to ask you this question. As somebody who collects all this information, what are some of like maybe your favorite data points or biometrics? What are some of the things, we've talked a little bit about heart rate variability, the skin response. Like what do you see, especially with your clinical background? Like what are some things that what are kind of your favorites to kind of when you start a new study with somebody or new program, what are some of the ones you're especially paying attention to?
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously HRV is one that's been widely used and becoming very apparent how beneficial it is to be able to track HRV. Another one that is EDA, which I mentioned earlier with the aggressive behaviors. That one
Mhm.
is a little harder with a couple of reasons. One is that there's just not commercial devices that
Yeah.
track it. There's like research grade, really expensive devices that track it. But we did some work with a little boy who had epilepsy. He was born with epilepsy. By the time he was 6, I mean, he had seizures every day. He was on a
Mhm.
lot of medications. And I think he was about 7 when we did this. But we strapped one of those EDA sensors to his ankle because he refused to wear it on his wrist. And he was in a playroom. He was in like a home-based program where he was in a playroom for a few hours a day. So we put just like security cameras, like 4 of them up in the corners. It was probably $200 in equipment altogether. I think we did like a 6-day where he wore the EDA sensor and we took video. We're trying to just understand better his seizures. So we obviously on the video we saw some obvious seizure events, but through the EDA signature we would see you could see these blips that were obviously, even to the untrained eye, I'm not an electrophysiologist, but I could see, okay, something happened here.
Mhm.
But then you look on the video and we're like, it just looks like he's just walking around.
Yeah.
So we truncated the video down. We like edited it down just to like those 2 minutes around each of those little blips that we saw in the EDA and sent it to his neurologist. So it ended up being like 5 minutes of video that the neurologist watched and saw the EDA signatures. Um, and then on his next appointment, the neurologist said, "We've been doing this all wrong. These are completely different types of seizures that I'm now seeing. And I can see them on the video. It was just a little stumble on the video that we didn't really think anything of it, but the neurologist knew it. He recognized that these were some other kind of seizure that were happening in a different part of the brain than the obvious ones that everybody could see, and that's what they'd been
Yeah.
treating. So they totally changed this kid's medication, and he was seizure free for the next 2 years, which was
Wow. How
really
cool.
amazing.
That is an awesome story. Very
Yeah.
cool. The other thing I wonder, because it's been a fascinating thing of mine, and I do, I do a lot of training in the trauma arena. One of the things that is really became very important very early on once I started to learn about trauma was the wellness of the staff and the organization in which
Mm.
services are delivered. And I wonder, in your work, we talk about, with polyvagal theory, the co-regulation piece, obviously as mental health folks, we know we better be valuable because that's what we've invested in. And so I kind of wonder, through any of these studies, have you looked at the impact of staff health as part of this as well, because I'm very convinced that, you know, a burned out, dysregulated staff is,
Mhm.
you know, going to be at least not effective, but maybe even triggering for a lot of the folks that we're trying to help. And I wonder if you've gained any insight into, you know, the stress of this work and anything along on those lines in the work that you've all done.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I really appreciate you raising that. It's such an important point. I mean, that's what I was like early on when I was before biometrics for me, and I was working with kids. You know, as I said, I knew my body was a tool that I could
Yeah.
pick up on that, but I could only do that if I was regulated,
Right.
right? If I
Yeah.
went in full of my own stuff in my head, I
Yeah.
wasn't conscious enough of what was happening for the kid. Um, and I had a lot of support to help me be in that place. So
Yeah.
my body was an instrument that was reliable to me rather than just telling me about the stories in my head. So that's a really important point. We were involved in a study, this was way back, I don't know, like 9, 10 years ago, with an inpatient adolescent psychiatric facility in Maine, who did just that. So we were working with these same sensors, the EDA sensors, and they had them on their kids, the patients, and they also had them on their staff, and they were looking for exactly that
Yeah.
co-regulation and how one impacts the other, with the intention of using that data to help for staff training, essentially to
Yeah.
help their staff learn how to help themselves be more regulated and help each other as a team be more regulated, and when they needed help, and be able to monitor that more clearly, because we are all connected in that way.
Yeah.
Our bodies are very finely tuned instruments, and we're picking up on other people's physiology all the time and are responding and reacting to that, often without knowing it, and then think it's something about us, and
Yep.
actually it's probably not really. It's about whatever's going on in the room that we're picking
Absolutely.
up. Yeah. So again, the
Absolutely.
idea of just bringing more of that into consciousness, a lot of the stuff that
Yeah.
operates subconsciously and has done throughout all of human evolution, we now have the opportunity to bring some of it up into the conscious level, so we can not only be aware of it ourselves, but be aware of that in our relationships, and bring that to the table and be like, hey, this is happening between us.
Yeah. And I think in the helping, healing, education professions, where we are such an important variable
Mm,
in whatever education, healing, treatment, whatever it might be, it's like, you know, and then just seeing the level of burnout devastate the professionals
right.
in these fields. It's like, man, it's like if we don't turn that, you know, lens on ourselves first in our organizations, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, what are we doing? And I'm starting to make the argument stronger and stronger. If we don't take care of ourselves, we're actually potentially doing harm, maybe actually doing harm, because we're in our sympathetic nervous systems,
Right.
but we're missing those. We don't bring the biology we need to help others heal, learn, you know, and that's an ethical issue in my regard. And I love
Mm-hmm.
how biometrics can give us a little bit of glimpse, and give us a language to talk about burnout in a different way as well.
Absolutely, yes. And I would love to see that more of a focus on that in the mental health
Yeah.
profession. I mean, these biometrics are being used in areas where there's often more funding, right? So,
Yes. Yeah.
like airline pilots, for instance, the
Yeah.
military, physicians, surgeons, those kinds of areas where there tends to be more funding.
Yes.
Biometrics are being used for that, for monitoring burnout and performance levels, which, and obviously you want your airline pilot to be like regulated and awake. And yeah,
Yes, we do.
absolutely agree with that. And our mental health professionals need the same. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. So
Mm.
that
And
brings
our
me to one of the questions that I just, from my experience, I gotta ask you, because you know, when I started, you know, and for longtime listeners of the podcast, I didn't know anything about HRV about 2 years ago. We went through about, you know, a 10 episode on this podcast with Kurt Moyer, who was on a lot of the shows earlier on about heart rate variability. And I started out not knowing, just hearing about it in books as a biometric, to thinking everybody in the world needed to be on an HRV monitor. You know, so I want to kind of ask you a question and then put some intensity at the end of it. Is one of the things I think that, like I said, I think is very clear. I think everybody in the helping, healing professions need this as a way just to track our overall health and wellness.
Mm.
But then the privacy issue comes up pretty
Mm.
quickly, especially because I think it's a great measure of what you're doing, could be a great measure of heart rate variability of organizational wellness too. And how
Mm.
does a supervisor support staff? But immediately it's like, oh, I don't trust my supervisor enough to share this information. Now, the same person has no problem seeing their client's information, but one level up and all of a sudden, no way. I was interested that Amazon's coming out with a device that actually assesses your vocal tunes. So Amazon's recording every word you say, and they say they delete it as soon as it gets to the
Mhm.
cloud and they analyze it. But I'm like, I get really excited about that. But then it's like, wow, like Big Brother is now literally on our wrist. And so one of the things is I'd love to see if you've had any of those problems. And I also like to think about, because one of the powerful things I see is that, whether we're talking about a surgeon, a airplane pilot, maybe even right now, I think a very intense example is a police officer
Mhm.
whose biometric data is showing is they're not doing well right now.
Mhm.
Have you guys struggled with, okay, do we allow that pilot to fly? Do we allow the surgeon to
Mhm.
operate? Do we allow the officer to go out on duty? So I love to throw a big kind of ethical question out there for you about where do you see this going as the technology gets better, and have you had any thoughts about how to use this on these pretty intense ethical questions that might have life and death consequences?
Yeah, yeah, it is a huge question. So most of our work is it's for universities, right? So they're working with consented, like informed consent
Yeah,
study participants who know exactly what they're getting into. They're coming in because they see some benefit for themselves and they're willing to share their data. So we've been working mostly in that arena. So that doesn't really come up, and it's all HIPAA compliant and it's anonymous and all that.
yeah,
But I totally hear that that's where the field is going.
yeah,
Um, and for me, so when you think about corporate wellness, that's an area that we have stepped into a little. The platforms we've worked with have allowed individual employees to see their own biometrics, but not be shared with the
yeah,
supervisors. But there's a way but it will alert employees if we see disruptions or sleep disruptions, and then they have the option of sharing the summary report with the organizational psychologist if they want to, so that then
yeah,
they can receive support around it and say, hey, this is what this machine is telling me.
yeah,
What can you as a human being tell me about this, and how can I work with it if they want to?
yeah,
um, and then it's up to the organization as what the protocols are around how that psychologist or counselor or whoever it is then what their mandate is in terms of sharing that
yeah,
information. Now, when you come to the police or EMTs, I mean, obviously, then, I mean, that's such a huge question that's up right now
yeah,
culturally is like, what are the requirements, the responsibilities of someone in that role, um, to be in a state, a regulated state, and
yeah,
that's not something that. So we work with an organization that they're called True North Behavioral Health out of Utah. They provide what's called Mind Shield, which is a emotional resiliency training specifically for first responders.
yeah,
They have worked with police departments and EMT and fire departments to provide emotional resiliency training to first responders. But typically, that's not what police departments get. They don't
right.
get that amount of training.
No,
So the idea of slapping something on their wrist that's suddenly now reporting it publicly, it
yeah,
seems just not okay. Without the training and the support that those people
yeah,
need to make sense of those data, to know how to use them for themselves so that they can regulate themselves. So it'd be more, I could see it more being useful as a personal biofeedback mechanism, along with then support from a mental health professional,
yeah,
to help them way before it gets anywhere being, to being public or being displayed to their supervisors, or there's, I think, a lot of work that has to be done to prepare those individuals
yeah.
for that kind of, and it could be incredibly beneficial to them as individuals, but yeah, It's a fine
Yeah,
line.
I mean, I think it's just an interesting because one of the COVID sort of, launching a new business in March this year was not the greatest timing, but we had one of our original folks before COVID wiped out all of our initial plans was a police department. And,
Yeah.
I think, it brought up some of those questions and, they weren't going to get individualized data. We were looking at the wellness of the department and giving the officers individual feedback. But it's like, what if an officer knows that they've been, in our terminology, red,
Hmm.
or, their heart rate variability has been 20-30% below their own norm for
Hmm.
5 days, and then something negative. Well, it raises these interesting issues that I think if we wrestle with them, we end up in a better place.
Yeah, I
But
agree.
man, in the age of Facebook and
Mm.
data share, I mean, it just is this hits people in a very big way, and yet you look at what Amazon's coming out with, and it takes it to a whole different level
Yeah.
of brave new world sort of thinking with this, which
Yeah.
is, I think, fascinating that we've hit this point.
Right. Right. And I mean, it's like any new technology,
Yeah,
it's like your intention behind it, like what you want to do this.
absolutely.
So yes, you can use it to try and take over the world and, you know,
Yeah,
be, and exactly as you're saying, if we really wrestle with these questions and really think about what is the most effective way and the most humane way
yeah,
to use this technology, it could be really a gift to a lot of
yes,
people. But we have to be willing to do that work and dig in and not just sort of put blankets over it that said, oh no, this is bad, it's against people's privacy, or everybody
yeah,
needs to be monitored. Like there's something in the middle that's way
yeah.
more than either of those extremes. And you got to be willing to put the time in and have the hard conversations with people that are actually involved in those frontline jobs to understand what that looks like.
Absolutely. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's so good to like nerd out about this
I
stuff.
know.
Somebody's been doing this for over a decade. I want to just give you with the final minutes that we have left. Just give an idea for our listeners about your company, the work you do, when someone might reach out to you to talk about integration into their programs or grants or studies of what they could do. So I'd love to learn more along with our audience about the great work you all are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as I said, we have been for the most of the past 11 years working with grant-funded researchers. So university-based researchers who are doing, it's called ecological momentary assessment or just-in-time adaptive interventions, those kind of research projects, or are working, or have not yet done those, but maybe are working in anxiety or suicide prevention or substance abuse and want to move into mobile interventions. Then they can just get on our website, illumiview.com, and there's a place for them to connect with us. And at this point, we are as a company now pivoting into more commercial organizations and applications. So I mentioned corporate wellness, so that's another one. I mentioned Mind Shield. So those working with first responder populations, we're in partnership with Mind Shield to deliver their content through our system,
Awesome.
so that can get out there to as many first responders as possible. Also clinical organizations. So if people who are involved with organizations that have substance abuse clinics often is a big one. There's lots of solutions we have that can help manage clients better, manage clinics better, get more
Yeah.
data, more touch points for patients, better actionable data for clinicians. We just developed a partnership with a company out of Israel called Cytec, who are working on psychedelic assisted therapies, which is
Oh,
starting to come to,
interesting.
especially like thinking about PTSD.
Yeah.
um, there's clinical trials going on right now with MDMA for
Yeah.
PTSD.
Yeah.
Um, there's trials with psilocybin. Ketamine's been used widely already in the United States. So they're really focused on psychedelic assisted therapy and are using our platform to help bring together patients and clinicians. So it's not just that they go to the clinic once and then they're off in space. They're connected through the app, that they have a daily touch point of like their experience is getting fed back to the clinician who sees a dashboard, sees how things are changing for the patients and which ones they need to reach out to. So there's a lot of different applications, but it's all on our website at illumiview.com.
Awesome. That now I've got to, you got to reach out to me when the psychedelic study is published. The fact that we can measure what I know clinically this isn't the terminology, but what goes on when somebody's tripping, just is a fascinating. I can't wait to see that data. And I think that one of the things I'm just fascinated with, whether it's kind of traditional healing approaches or these sort of interventions, whether it's natural or synthetic substances that we sort of put a evil stamp on, I think a little too early to start to look at these things under a new lens and what happens during a shamanic ritual or a psychedelic experience. I mean, we can start to ask these things as well as what goes on during cognitive behavioral therapy, and really take away our judgment on those things and look at things under a whole new light, which I think is just, as I say, this is a golden age of psychology because Freud never was able to ask these questions. Jung just had to theorize about all this.
Yeah.
You and I can talk about, hey, what's the percentage of heart rate variability increase once this intervention was delivered? And, it gives us like this data that I think 10, 15 years from now, with the work you all and a lot of us are trying to do, we'll be in a whole different place about understanding about human beings and human consciousness. So it was so great, Kat, to have this conversation with you. And I know our listeners will appreciate it as well. And we'll put the information that Kat shared on the show notes at traumainformedlens.org. And Kat, if you have any interesting studies or anything going on in the future, please know the door is open to talk about that, because I think the insights you're giving is going to, again, really change how we look at ourselves and the work that we do. So I want to thank you very much for joining the show.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate you having me here, and for all the work that you're doing as well, just making mental health more of a talking point. I think it's just really important.
Love doing it. Thank you so much.